session. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet today. For me, it's the Ngunnawal Ngambri people here in Canberra. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. My name is Asha Samaris and I'll be chairing today's session. We've got Rochelle Schoff. Are you ready to present, Rochelle?
Yeah, hi. I'll share my slides.
Thank you.
Can you guys see that on the screen? Good. Okay, wonderful. I'll start then. So my name's Rochelle Schoff. I'm really excited to present and listen to everyone's presentations today. So thanks to ANU and ACUR for getting us all happening. This is coming out of a historical research project that I've been doing with ACU this year as a part of my honours degree. So I'm looking at the interwar new states movements that emerged in regional Australia after the First World War, when several towns and cities in the Riverina began calling for separation from the state of New South Wales and for the region to be admitted into the Commonwealth as an independent state. The new states movements imagined a future of a prosperous and populous white Australia based on small agricultural regions that were interconnected by decentralized trade and transport, and also shared a common pioneer history. So briefly, my conceptual framework draws from Benedict Anderson, who has described the way that national identities are formed and define themselves. In his influential book, Imagined Communities, Anderson proposes that national identity is conceptualized as a community where citizens imagine themselves connected to one another through a number of factors that include things like a shared geography, history, or print vernacular. I'm interested in the way that regional and rural communities imagine their collective identity alongside broader state, national, and imperial identities. So the new states movements articulated a sense of distinct regional identity that often dovetailed quite neatly with Australian nationalism in its aims for a white population and modern development of the Australian landscape. But simultaneously, the new states movements challenged the political structures and boundaries of the Australian federal state system. The interwar Riverina New States movement was rooted in historical separation movements from the 19th century. The Riverina had previously been the site of colonial rivalries between New South Wales and Victoria, and historically, Riverina settlers had complained of being in a fiscal cul-de-sac, where trade with Sydney was hampered by inadequate roads, and much more accessible opportunities to trade across the Murray into Victorian ports were tightly controlled by colonial customs authorities. Riverina residents expressed a sense of disgruntlement that Sydney was too far away to adequately govern all of the territory in the New South Wales colony, and that the regions north and south of the Murray shared much more in common with each other than the rest of New South Wales and Victoria. So the case was generally put forward that Riverina's independence was that it was a very fertile region that was actually connected and not separated by the Murray, which provided opportunities for trade, transport, and irrigation. And these arguments were built upon and echoed by the 20th century new states movements. So the problem of inadequate trade routes to Sydney had been much improved by the rollout of railway systems across the state in the late 19th century, but this did not completely resolve the difficulties with interregional trade, nor did it eradicate Riverina residents' sense of isolation from urban capitals. And Albury had for a long time been a major rail hub between Sydney and Melbourne by facilitating cargo and passenger changeovers, which was necessary up until 1962 because the state rail networks operated on different gauge sizes. The first separation movements were held in Berrigan, calling for the region south of the Murrumbidgee to be attached to Victoria. But it was in 1921, a conference was held at Albury to discuss the grievances with New South Wales State Railways. And out of that conference came the decision to form the Riverina New States movement. And the Riverina was not alone in calling for separation from New South Wales. Parts of northern New South Wales and around New England, like Grafton and Tamworth, had been campaigning for separation since 1915. Eventually, these movements combined led to the New South Wales State Royal Commission in 1924 and again in 1935. Both times the movements were unsuccessful in redrawing the state boundaries, but this is not so much the focus of my presentation. I'm more interested in looking at how new states movements and the Riverina movement in particular articulated a sense of regional distinction. So one of the key ideas of the New States movements was the idea of an area of natural interest. And that was again related to this idea of the Murray Riverlands being its own geographic unit based on its fertile environment and connection to the river. And there was some debate about where exactly the proposed boundaries of the riverine estate should be drawn. I have on the screen here a map for you, which you can see. There's the state of New South Wales, and this is kind of the riverina area, where they would say the Albury League was proposing that the boundaries should be drawn along the Murray River, and it should come all the way here to South Australia and go north up to Cowra West and east to where Canberra is, the Australian Capital Territory. And now notably, this did not include any parts of Victoria, even though Victorian river cities like Mildura and Wodonga wanted to join the riverine estate. This was largely a strategic decision. The New States Leagues mainly expected to be unsuccessful at the 1924 state referendum and intended to use the state parliament's rejection to build the case, to build a federal case to amend section 124 of the Commonwealth Constitution. The proposed amendment would allow new states to be created without the consent of existing states, so that the riverina could claim parts of New South Wales and Victoria without the consent of those states. So the New States movements developed out of these historical separation movements from the colonial period, but the interwar movements also looked to the United States for inspiration. They were especially drawing on what they were seeing, what was happening in the Midwest, which was more densely populated than Australia and had high levels of agricultural production. And the New States movements attributed the success of these Midwestern states to their geographically smaller state sizes. They also saw Henry Ford's attempts to decentralize urban industry by moving factories to rural areas to combine both agricultural and industrial labor pools as a possible way to increase rural living standards and bring industry to the country. So decentralization was part of this broader social and political platform that tied into many of the New States movement arguments. And the rise of the motor car after the First World War in the US and Australia would provide a particular means of connecting and populating rural and regional areas. I have an article here from the Goulburn Penny Post, which was a bit later, but it imagined a future of the Australian landscape to be a chain of cities connected from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. And this idea of an interconnected, developed and decentralized rural landscape was deeply connected to the White Australia policy and the racial anxieties of the interwar period. And this article that I have here went on to say that the whole point of decentralizing and populating Australia from coast to coast was to better protect against invasion from, and I quote, the land-hungry hordes of other races. So in 1918, a writer by the name of Edward James Brady published a book called Australia Unlimited, in which he argued that the Australian continent had the ability to sustain a population of 200 million people. He suggested that Australia's central deserts and semi-arid lands could actually be converted into arable farmland. And this is a deeply settler colonial way of understanding the environment of this continent. It looks at it kind of is a nation building project that imagines Australia's environment as something malleable that can be molded to support the dream of a prosperous white Australia. And Brady's call for an unlimited Australia was echoed by New States movements, and he himself was even recorded to have attended some of the New States meetings in New England during this time. So the New States movements drew on this idea that Australia was troubled by vast swathes of empty space and untapped potential, and that the New South Wales state government had failed in its duty to populate the nation. An article from the Albury News in 1924 said that the New States' aim was to get the empty spaces filled. And interestingly, I explore this even more in my thesis. I don't have too much time to get into it today, but the Albury New States League also tried to articulate a slight cultural argument for its own regional distinction. In 1924, the New States League published a handbook to mark the city's celebrations of the centenary of Human Hovel's crossing of the Murray River in 1824. And some of the organizers of the Human Hovel Centenary were also members of the New States League. So there's this interesting overlap where the city of Albury was trying to develop a sense of its own local history, mainly through the language of the pioneer legend and the celebration of the first white settlers to cross the Murray River. But these celebrations taking place alongside the New States movement and the 1924 Royal Commission in the same year brings up a lot of questions about how the city was trying to frame its identity as a rural, modern, and white, prosperous community with its own links to Australia's national pioneer history. And it's one of the ways that the New States League imagined its history is inextricable from the geography of the Riverina region. So to sum up, the interwar Riverina New States movement emerged from historical frustrations over the Murray border and isolation from the state government in Sydney. It asserted the Riverina's identity as one that was distinct from the rest of New South Wales based on its connection to the Murray River region and its settler, colonial and pioneer history. And the interwar movement also drew on national debates over empty spaces and white settlement, and imagined the future of Australian states to be one made up of geographically smaller, locally governed regions that would be better able to promote white settlement and achieve a higher standard of living and agricultural production in rural areas. And that's just my bibliography. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle. I'll hand now to the judges to ask any questions.
I have a question, if I may. Thank you, Rochelle. Very nice presentation. Very interesting topic in Australia. A little bit unrelated to what you've precisely talked about, but you mentioned that it is maybe part of your thesis. Why were those bids to create smaller inland regional areas unsuccessful? Because it seems to make a lot of sense. There are very different regions to the coastal regions, and they face very different challenges. So I'm interested to know why that didn't work.
I think for a lot of the sort of state referendums, their kind of inability to get the rest of the state to agree. The state parliament for New South Wales certainly didn't want the state to be broken up into smaller areas. So kind of the failure and not being successful also at changing the constitution led to that, yeah.
Thanks very much, Rochelle. Oh, sorry, maybe you had another follow-up question.
You go for it.
I was just curious, really interested, and you know, the history is fascinating when you get into the story and listen to the story as you've told it. Sort of, where are we at with the? Is there still interest in this interwar, if you like?
I think, yeah, so this movement carried on, not so much in the Riverina, but it's always been stronger in sort of the New England area, and it carried on after the Second World War throughout the 60s. And I think there are definitely some people around today who are still in favour of more decentralisation or new states in New South Wales. I think it has been interesting. I'm actually from Albury in the border region. So during COVID, there's been a whole lot more debates about border closures and separations and border communities that have been separated by these borders, and kind of asking like, yeah, why is that? Because these areas have more in common with each other than they do with Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll still have a couple of minutes for questions. So if there any audience members would like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box. I'll just give that 30 seconds. Okay, thank you so much, Rochelle. We'll just hand to our last speaker, Yiting. Yiting, please go ahead when you're ready.
Can everyone see my screen? Okay. Okay, hello everyone, I'm Yiting. I'm a sociology honors student in the University of Sydney. Today I will give you a presentation about the rethinking of 2019 to 2020 Hong Kong protest analysis. And in March 2019, the mainland China government enacted the Fugitive Offenders ordinance and which allow for extraditing Hong Kong suspects to the mainland China for trial. And due to the distrust of the mainland judicial system, the Hong Kong community was concerned that extraditing suspects would undermine Hong Kong independent judicial system under the one country, two system basic law. And then the anti-extradition law amendment bill movement had erupted in Hong Kong. And in response to the movement, much of the comments in Western and Hong Kong societies has focused criticism on mainland China government's behaviors. However, I found that the public opinion abroad was very different from the information I had received from China. As I believe that we should look at the issue from multiple sides, I therefore investigate why the Chinese government's action were perceived as violence, rather than make preconceived notions that the Chinese government is violent and criticize them. And so a review of Hong Kong historical resource. The movement process supplemented by the bourgeois theory and Adrian's bourgeois symbolic power theory and Adrian's concept of violence. Concepts of violence as the supplemented analytical tools. My results suggest three main focuses that have influenced people's impression on Chinese government's behavior negatively. The first one is Hong Kong's unique social system, and the second one is the distorted government's images made by media influences and youth pressure, and the last one is the chaotic conflicts. And to give you clear understanding of the results, I will first introduce some key concepts in my research, and then I will provide you with more detailed explanations of the three main results. And firstly, the symbolic power is a power to construct reality and impose particular value system on the others. It can make people mistake a truth in the interest of dominant group and is essentially arbitrary for universal truth. But the symbolic power needs to be coupled with the habitus to gain the authority without questioning. And the habitus could be understood as people's cognitive pattern, which can perceive, recognize, and capture the external stimuli, and is largely indoctrinated into the population by the state established orders such as the educational and the legal systems. And authority is the guaranteeing of the government's action, and losing authority can cause government's action to be questioned, which can lead to civil disobedience. And the power, according to Arendt, is depend on the concerns and is grounded in a dialogical relationship. And Arendt argues that violence can destroy power and has opposite qualities of power. And the power of Arendt depends on cooperation, dialogue, legitimacy, and where violence is destructive rather than productive. And my first results show that Hong Kong's autonomy allowed it to have a different social system than that of the mainland China. Therefore, the Hong Kong public may possess a different habitus compared to the mainland society. For example, one survey about Hong Kong citizens' core social values revealed that there are about 80 to 90% of citizens consider the judicial independence and press freedom to be important, but only about 70% of the citizens consider the national interest to be important. And therefore, the Hong Kong public's different habitus could make the mainland government's actions inconsistent with their valuing of freedom and independence. Hence, the questioning of the legitimacy of government's action can suppress the government's authority and provoke the civil disobedience. And the current study also found that the media influence was always a critical factor in the movement. Firstly, new media's communication efficiency make the ordinary people can share information with the public easily. This implies that by using new media, and more conflicts could be brought in front of the public's attention. Thus, according to the opposite qualities of violence and power, it is reasonable to consider that even small-scale conflicts also can make public weaken government's power and identify them as violence. For example, on June 9, 2019, police and demonstrators were exposed to clashes. One police officer was attacked, but the incident was then widely reported on the internet as police violence injuring themselves. And secondly, illustrated media publicity against police violence can help increase public's emotional engagement and direct their attention to a more emotional target. As one research showed that news reports featuring conflicting images, action images could increase people's emotional engagement and influence their political views. Therefore, it is reasonable to argue that the heavily illustrated media publicity only against the supposedly police violence can inflame the demonstrators' political statements and further make people distort government's behaviors. And thirdly, most demonstrators are youths, and the social media is the primary tool for them to obtain information and make contacts in the movement. And one research showed that Hong Kong's economic polarization in recent years has made increasing youths are blaming political issues for their dissatisfaction with state core. So the efficient media spreading of the negative media publicity against for the government, coupled with the accumulated social pressure of youth, could be the reason for the people to generate negative evaluations on government's actions and legislation. And finally, during the protest, the government's authority and power were firstly degraded through the different habits and media's promotion of conflicts, and then the illustrated media publicity, not only against supposedly police violence, can cause more politically emotional, provocative, and coupled with the Hong Kong's youth pressure, also help to increase public's responsiveness to construct the movement's force. However, Hong Kong protests develop a leaderly style of organization, which implies that the movement has always lacked a representativeness to dialogue with the government and can then lead to accumulation of unsolved political emotions. And then the accumulation of power, force, and radicalization emotions among demonstrators and the suppression of government's power together drag the movement into the abyss of violence. Eventually, in the midst of extremely chaotic conflict situation, the mainland governments whose power is already suppressed will be considered violent even for some legitimate actions. And for example, in the midst of an extremely chaotic conflict situation, the mainland government whose power is already suppressed will be considered violent even for some legitimate actions. For example, on March 31, 2020, Hong Kong police arrested 61 protesters for drop portal bombs, was publicized as police violence. And in conclusion, so rethinking the 2019 to 2020 Hong Kong protests, current study has identified 3 reasons that may influence negative external perceptions of Chinese government's behaviors. And firstly, is the Hong Kong's unique social system have weakened the mainland government's authority in socially constructing Hong Kong society. And secondly, the high dissemination rate of social media in political emotions inflammatory associated political pictorial messages and the accumulated Hong Kong's young social pressure have together created the possibilities for Hong Kong for government's behaviors to be heavily distorted. And finally, the above factors then further exacerbate the conflict's intensity and make mainland governments' behaviors more difficult to be differentiated from the in the chaotic conflict situation. And finally, due to the network limitation and language barriers, not just in the 2019 to 2020 Hong Kong protests, but also in some similar events before, the mainland China government really prevailed in the international public opinion field. This has led to many commentaries against the Chinese governments being negative Of course, I'm not here to define the perfect image of a particular government. I just hope my result can be complementary for more researchers to allowing for more objective evaluations on the Chinese government's actions and positions. And this is my references. And thank you.
Thank you, Yiting. I'll hand over to the judges for any questions.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Yiting. Really enjoyed your presentation, and the use of the images was really engaging as well. So thank you for that. Again, a disclosure: this is way outside my field, and anything about it is picked up, just by watching it. But I was curious about if you could comment on media and youth, as one of the factors that attributed to your findings, and this is my ignorance, but is the media platforms regulated by the governments in Hong Kong?
I don't think so. Like maybe they have some official, like the media officer organizations, but they're not totally controlled by the government, I think.
So they can write with it. So it's like for, where we get lies all over social media, it's a big problem. They attributed in the US, lies, just more lies that is not being controlled. And I was because I thought in China there was some sort of degree of control on what was published on media, but I wasn't sure the situation in Hong Kong. So thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. Any question?
I can't really thank you, Yiting, I should say, for an excellent presentation. It was really illuminating, actually, to hear more about, I don't want to say the struggles, but certainly how a lot of factors contribute to a global image of any government, like China or the US, as what Michelle's already highlighted. I don't really have much of the questions, but what really struck me listening to you is just how media plays such a big role now in how we perceive almost anything, from political systems to beauty and body images, and even science. Media is almost everything, and I'm a little bit worried that listening to this, that the intelligence of the populace is not challenged in the right way, because they just believe whatever they're told on media, no matter where it comes from. And I thought you highlighted that really, really well. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a couple more minutes. I'll just see if there's any questions from the audience.
Okay.
Okay, looks like we're all good. Thank you so much, Yiting.
Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of today's session. Firstly, I'd like to thank our judges, Dr. Michelle Hall and Dr. Ulrike Schumann. And of course, congratulations to our students presenters today. So this recording will be made available online following the conference, and I hope that you all enjoy the last couple of days of the conference today and tomorrow. Thank you all.